Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here as part of the Sustainable Development MOOC. I am broadcasting from New York, and I imagine you are in many places around the world. At any rate, the subject today is urban research. This is a very exciting topic, as you can imagine, because of what's happening around the world. You've already heard of the dominance of urban populations. You will already should be thinking about the fact that there are important synergies between the rural and urban populations. And in fact, this so-called divide between these two areas is simply not in existence today because of the rise of technology, the interdependence of these areas, and so forth. So when we talk about research, then, we're talking about research about urban places, but urban places in their relationship to their surrounds. And their surrounds are as small as the neighborhood and as large as the nation and the globe. So let's jump in and think about how we are thinking about urban research, the questions that we are addressing, but more importantly, the methods that we're using to answer those questions. For the purposes of this conversation, I think we should be thinking about under what conditions can we achieve urban sustainable development. And to answer these questions, we have many techniques and many approaches. We can rely on the traditional use of data that comes from census activities, quantitative data that can give us patterns about what's happening around the world or in various places. We can rely on qualitative data, which has grown in use to explain what is happening with more detail in terms of sustainable development. And we can be thinking about new forms of data that are helping both the qualitative and quantitative approaches, in particular the use of remote sensing, satellite data, and so forth. And this is extremely useful when you think about places where data is limited from the point of view of collecting grand and great masses of urban data. But I see we have a number of questions this morning, so maybe we should start answering those, and then we can go on and talk about other topics. Priyank Parakesh asks, how do you see changes in urban research methods with the evolution of mobile technology, data collection, and distribution? Well, this is a revolution. Never before were we able to get to the use of cell phones, for example, to track and understand what is happening in people's lives in urban areas and their surrounds. So the fact that we have now got the data, there are methods to analyze the data, excuse me, and that we can use this data to get to very fine-grained questions is extremely important. What we need, however, when we're thinking about using this data is among the world of urban researchers and scholars and so forth, we need to think about the standards which we will use to measure and gauge that data. So this is a project that we need to be working on. Rena Rai is asking, recently there's been an increase in the Mellon Foundation funded urban humanities groups and departments in a number of universities, at least in North America. What is the place of this sort of humanities-based research regarding the urban? How does this fit into the existing body of research about the urban? Well, this is a wonderful question because my university, in fact, does have one of these grants from the Mellon Foundation. And so we've been involved with this from the day that this was conceived. Number one, I should let you know that these grants have not been given only to US universities. They've been given to other universities around the world, and particularly in South Africa, the University of Witwatersrand does have a grant. The London School of Economics has a grant, and I'm not sure about the other ones, but I can tell you it's not just a US-centric activity. Each one of these grants has its own definition, and that's Mellon's choice in doing this. They worked with the grantees. They said, well, we know you all have humanities activities in your universities, but we need to shape these research grants and these activities grants in a way that will meet with your university so we can institutionalize this idea that humanities have a role in understanding the urban growth, urban development, and so forth. So what these grants have done, they've been around now for about 5 years, is to stimulate groups of scholars around universities to engage in new courses, to engage in new kinds of research, to bring students into the understanding that the humanities have a definite role in understanding how urban places work, and to complement that role with the large body of social science research that exists. At the University of Pennsylvania, where I actually am administering one of these grants, we have done a number of things. We, first of all, have had for the past 4 years a faculty and PhD colloquium in which we discuss the research. Number two, we've engaged in new courses where we've insisted that one professor from one side, the humanities, work with another professor on the other side, the design field, and develop courses that bring these two things together. So we've had courses looking at Brazil, looking at China. I myself gave a course with a French literature professor where we looked at the development of modern Paris. And let me tell you, I had a great discovery in this particular course. While we were reading lots of literature, I also was, of course, revisiting the work that I'd done before, looking at the growth of 19th century Paris, and looking at some of the photographic materials. And all of a sudden, I realized that the development of Paris in the late 19th century was very similar to what we're seeing in rapidly developing countries today. Not the scale, but certainly the same kinds of issues. The lack of basic services, the lack of proper layouts, the lack of housing, the lack of planning, and so forth. And though the solutions may not be the solutions we would use today, the point is that there are solutions to these kinds of situations, and the humanities will show us one way as we look at history. So enough about that. I think we need to go on to the next question, which is Simone Maria is asking, what are the biggest challenges of urban research, and what are the most promising recent developments? Well, that is a very big question. I think the biggest challenge of urban research is to bring together the vast amount of research that exists around the world. A year or so ago, I was hoping that out of Habitat 3, we might get some sort of proposal to create a panel on sustainable urbanization with the idea of creating an understanding of the state of urban research around the world and what it has to say about sustainable urbanization. My thinking here was that, number one, I was drawing parallels to the climate change world. And if one looks back, again, being a historian, if one looks back at the 1980s, early 1990s, who heard of climate change? Well, a few meteorologists and maybe a few people who followed those meteorologists, but this was not a topic of global conversation. However, the creation of the IPCC with its periodic reports every 4 years or so, looking at the literature, their job was to look at refereed research articles and say, okay, what's happening with climate change? And ultimately, we began to have a world conversation about climate change because of the collection of the research around a few questions. Well, imagine if we could do that for sustainable urbanization. What is the research collectively around sustainable urbanization? What do we know works and doesn't work? What are we finding through research in terms of the issues that need to be dealt with? Is it housing alone? Is it some combination of housing and transportation and environment? Well, we know that answer. But at any rate, the point is that I think one of the biggest challenges of urban research is to collectively understand where we are with it, where it's going, and most importantly, where the gaps are in that research. So that's something that there's an emerging group of researchers around the world who are interested in doing this. We'll see if we can pull this off. And then the most promising recent developments. Let's see. There are lots of promising recent developments. Number one, there's the growth of journals, of dedicated journals. Your Institute of the Indian Institute of Human Settlements has started a very important journal. There's the growth of urban-focused research centers, again, creating research, not just research that happens in the Western world, but research that's happening around the world in different places. So the location of these research centers in various parts of the world is extremely important, because that generates local research, which may have very different answers in different places. And in terms of recent developments, I would say the growth of satellite imagery, particularly the growth of something called the Global Human Settlements Layer, is very, very important, because this is a technology that allows you to see what the settlement patterns are around the world in almost real time, over time, and to see exactly what is happening in terms of the basic physical structure. And when we're talking about urban research, we have to remember it's about place. It's about people, but it's about place and what happens in place. And overlaid with this global human settlements layer is a population grid, so you can get some estimate as to what is happening with people and places and so forth. Why is this important? Because we do have data from the World Urbanization Prospects, which was on your reading list, but I hope you realized when you read that the data comes from the individual nations' reports of what is urban. And this varies around the world. For example, in the United States, a place is urban if it has 2,500 people. Other places require 50,000 people before it's urban, or 20,000 people before it's urban, or a certain percentage of people not working in rural activities. The point is that the definitions vary. And so what we have from the UN, it's the only thing we have, is a very good estimate about what urban is. But what the satellite imagery shows us is physically, particularly when it's overlaid with the population grids, physically and population-wise, where is urban happening? And it's often happening in places that are not collected by the census. So that's pretty exciting about that. I have another question here from, it's erased, but I'll go to question 7. Question 6 seems to be erased. Maybe that can be brought back. Elaine Cook or Koch asks, what are some of the challenges urban researchers face in describing the global South, especially with regards to understanding informality? Well, this is changing very rapidly. The obvious problem is the data is not particularly well collected in these informal settlements. But we have a couple of things happening. We have the scientific knowledge of the remote sensing, which I was discussing, but we also have locally collected knowledge, locally collected information, particularly the work that the Shack Dwellers, Slum Dwellers International is doing, calling Know Your City. And here you have census data being recorded and mapped and brought to the municipality so that we're able to see exactly what's happening in terms of population. We're also beginning to see a lot more ethnographic work being done in understanding informality, and that's extremely important in understanding what the dynamics are inside informal settlements. You won't get that from the counting of heads, but you will get that from participant observation, from survey research, and so forth. So the growth of qualitative research is extremely helpful in understanding informality and how the economics work, how social life works, and so forth. So I think it's extremely helpful here. We need to do a lot more work, but it's extremely helpful. Question 8 is from Indu S. In a city like Bangalore that has grown massively in the past 15 or 20 years, there are lots of sectors that have grown without any future thought or any level of understanding of the depth it is now in. How and what are your thoughts on cities that are growing very quickly, especially when the government does not foresee the basic quality of life as an aspect? Well, I think this is where the organization of local partners, I'm going to call them partners, or local groups, are extremely important. You may or may not know that through the Habitat 3 process, we created at the global level, and are now transplanting it down to the local level, something called the General Assembly of Partners, otherwise known as GAP. And this is a group of 16 partner groups representing the 9 major groups of the United Nations. These are groups like local governments and authorities, subnational authorities, business and industry, farmers, youth and civil society, and so forth. But we added to those 9 groups 7 more that represent interested groups in this area, everything from media to these persons with disabilities to older persons and so forth, grassroots organizations. So as we think about research and understanding what needs to be done, we need to empower and work with multi-stakeholder groups that will help capture through research and through activism the life of people in these fast-growing sectors and bring that to the attention of local government. But it's not just local government that has to be involved and informed as to what is happening. If you take a look at the New Urban Agenda, which is the outcome document from the Habitat 3 conference, which one could probably characterize as a roadmap for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are aspirational and set goals. You can think of the New Urban Agenda of addressing with great detail how to meet those goals. And it's not just goal 11, which is the goal focusing on cities, but it's the urban aspects of basically the 17 goals that we're thinking about with the New Urban Agenda. And in that, there are 5 areas that are thought to be very important in terms of action. And the first area is thinking about what national urban policies will be essential for the creation of sustainable urbanization. Why are we interested in national urban policies? Because even though most of the action will take place at the local level, we definitely need a national government thinking about what are the things that it can do to balance regions, to create communication among different regions, and so forth. We also need to have, when we're thinking about the tools that we need to put forward and the work that we need to do here, is what kind of urban frameworks, legal frameworks are needed? How is property defined? How are contracts defined? These are national decisions that have to be put forward so that local governments can work appropriately. We need, of course, urban planning and design that's responsive to rapid growth. We don't need static master plans, but we need strategic plans that are thinking about what are the next critical investments that we need to deal with this rapid growth. It may be the investment in the transportation system that will link outlying areas to the jobs. It might be a combination of this, and it should be a combination of this, obviously, thinking about where the next growth sectors are going to occur and laying them out in a way so that you can preserve public lands for the purposes of public activities, laying pipes for sanitation, having streets, having room for schools and so forth, but also providing that land for adequate housing. So we need good planning and design. We also need to be thinking about the urban economy and municipal finance. We need to empower cities so that they can be able to raise the funding that they need to supply the services that are essential for a sustainable city. And lastly, we need to, again, think about local implementation, how we engage, again, the partners groups that I was describing before with local, regional, and national government for the implementation of a fast-growing place. So we've got lots to do, but we have a roadmap for doing it. So G. Gupta is asking, is there a metropolitan bias in studying urban? How can it be fixed? Well, I started out this talk very briefly saying that, yes, we're talking about urban research, but when we think about urban research, we need to think about not just the city itself, not just the neighborhoods within the city itself, but we need to think regionally with the immediate surrounds and what the relationships are. And there's certain research questions there. Those research questions might have to do with logistics. They might, how do you bring food supplies into the city, that kind of thing. Or they might have to do with ecosystem protection. How do we protect the ecosystem services, the provision of water, not just for the cities, but also for the agricultural product. So we need to be thinking about natural resources regionally. And we need to think about the kinds of jobs that are best done in cities where agglomeration is important, in less and dense urban areas where other kinds of jobs can be done where agglomeration but is not so important, but communication is. So we have to make sure that we have the kinds of communication, and we're talking about here internet communication, digital communication, and so forth, so that you can have basically strong, solid, economically productive, sustainable regions. If you say metropolitan bias, I would say there's a human settlement bias, thinking about how you create the building blocks of a nation. The building blocks of a nation are its cities with its surrounding areas, which are metropolitan areas, which include rural, quasi-rural, quasi-urban, urban, and neighborhood activities. So you have to think along a continuum. All right, question 6. Kranthi Kumar M asked, what is the effectiveness of the ratio of individual actors in the decision making from politics, governance, professionals, planners, urban designers, and policymakers? There's no defined ratio of the number of people you need in different roles. What's important is the definition of those roles and the recognition of the legitimacy of those roles. So you need processes and frameworks, as I mentioned earlier, that show who does what, where, and when. And I would refer to you a document that was just created in consultation with partners by the Habitat Agency, called the Action Framework for the Implementation of the New Urban Agenda. I believe you'll find that on the Habitat site. If not, I can send it to you. But the point is that in a complex set of activities that have to do with urban growth within a nation, there are particular activities that are best done by different groups of people. And those things need to be defined within the context of how things work in a particular city, in a particular nation. So we can't say there's a formula, we can't say there's a ratio, but what we can say is there needs to be recognition that there are different roles for different groups, and these things need to be worked out in a peaceful way so that you can create arenas for developing consensus, developing the decision-making processes that are recognized, legitimate, and effective. I hope that answers this question. Again, I'm at a very high level, and one needs to drill down to think about what context you're in, to think about who and what might occur. But I do refer you to that action framework for the implementation of the new urban agenda. It gives you some ideas. Question 10. Teju, in India, the census is carried once in 10 years. How do you think we could rely on this when we are planning now, say in 2017? How do you think we can overcome this problem? Okay, this is a problem everywhere. Censuses are extremely expensive to conduct. Some are more accurate than others. We need to do two things. Number one, we need to work with the statisticians who can make some projections. They usually do high, medium, low projections based on past activities. That'll give us some direction as to where things are going. And we can also begin to bring in some of these new technologies that we talked about at the top of the hour. We talked about the use of mobile technologies. We talked about satellite imagery and the estimations of population with regard to that. Those can help update the census every 10 years. And lastly, we can add the local knowledge that we talked about in a systematic way. It's a question of balancing the cost of collecting adequate data across a nation, which every 10 years is not an unusual amount of time, because it takes time, number one, to assess what the previous 10 years have told us, and to get that information out, that takes somewhere between 3 to 5 years. And then it takes time to figure out, of course, the basic questions will remain, but there might be new questions that might be added to a census. And also, there are always improvements that can be made in the collection of data for a census. Even the most advanced countries do not collect census data at 100% rate that they should. And so there's lots of work to be done to perfect a census, and it takes a period of time, not only to perfect it, but also to assess and deliver the results to the public. Question 11. Anusha Yadav asked, at what scales urban research needs to be carried out, the ward, the neighborhood, the regional scale, in the sense to understand the impacts and the outcomes? Well, Anusha, it depends upon the question you're asking. So if you are particularly interested about what is happening in a small microcosm of the city, and you might want to set up some experimental, randomized experimental controlled experiments when you're looking at particular neighborhoods and you're comparing a question in those neighborhoods. It might be the delivery of services. It might be about health. It might be about nutrition. It might be about housing quality, that you might want to understand what's happening within a city and you want to see it at the neighborhood level. Again, you would go to the regional scale if you were talking about larger questions, maybe transportation or ecosystem services. How effective are they, and so forth? Or let's look at transportation at the regional scale. You would want to know basic population questions, settlement patterns, and so forth in order to think about the effectiveness and the needs for different types of transportation services. So, and transportation usually is delivered at the regional scale, so you might want to talk about that, but of course you would want to drill down to the neighborhood to make sure that transportation was reaching the neighborhoods that you were thinking about. So the scale is dependent on the question. I missed 12, it went too fast, but we can go to question 13. Alicia S. Chow, I would like to know your opinion of the certification system such as LEED in achieving Goal 11. Okay, Goal 11 has specific target goals, has specific targets within it. There are 7 plus 3, there are 10. There are 7 high-level targets, I would say, basically dealing with housing, transportation, disaster planning, public space, environmental impact, and so forth. And then there are 3 that talk about planning again, or national urban policy. And the actual last one talks about using sustainable building materials in building. So LEED, which is a US-based certification system, could be useful, but there are other nations have other certification systems that could be used as well. The point is, you want to have a set of standards that are generally accepted in the nation or the place in which you're working, in which to measure the progress that's occurring in the various targets. So LEED could be one solution, but there may be others that are more appropriate for other places. You just have to have, probably at the national level, if not at the regional level among nations, or the level that associates nations at certain levels of development. You'd have to think about how to do this. Certain certification systems that would show you whether the buildings were sustainable or not. You probably know that there's an interagency expert group on the Sustainable Development Goals that has developed a number of indicators for the full set of sustainable development goals. There are 17 goals, 169 targets, and something like 200 indicators that are under consideration. You might want to take a look at those. They have been ranked by this group as into tiers. The first tier are indicators that are easily collected and have been collected. The second tier is a tier that represents indicators that have a methodology for them, but they're not widely collected. And the third tier has a designation that they need to be, the method needs to be developed. So you might take a look at the indicators for that target 10 of goal 11 to see what they're talking about. Delkan Sharp asks, will the biggest challenges in making cities sustainable be in the developed world or in the developing world? It's all over the world. It's not binary. There are different types of issues within each category of the world. The developing world has issues with regard to the provision of housing of a certain standard. The developed world has issues with, I'm just giving this as an example, of developing housing that's affordable. So does the developing world. But the point is that there are categories of problems within each of the sustainable development categories that definitely have implications for each level of income that the nation has, a given nation has. And the whole beauty of the SDGs is, number one, they're universal. Number two, they rely on nations to set the context, or to establish a context in which they are going to develop the policies to achieve them, and to measure themselves against this context. So every one of those goals has an implication for all of the 193 nations that signed on to them, but each nation will have to decide what that context is and how they will meet the demands of the SDGs, in particular, how they will measure the indicators that are set up by that interagency expert group that I've talked about, which has established those indicators, have been given to the Statistical Commission on the UN, given them to the General Assembly, and the nations have agreed to pursue those indicators. So there's a whole important system to be looked at and then applied locally. Okay, question 12. Simone Maria, I think you asked a question before, Simone. How do you think urban theory and research can reach local policymakers? Should urban research have an explicit policy-oriented perspective? Well, what use is urban theory and research if it doesn't meet local policy makers? I mean, you want it to sit up in a cloud? Absolutely not. We need to make sure that when we engage in urban research, that we obviously create research methods that are replicable and that can answer the question that we might have. But I would say, in particular, urban research should always have a section at the end, when it's giving its findings, that talks about how this research might be applied to, be thought about within the context or construct of urban policy, of policy. Again, I'm of the mind that our urban research, though it might be basic in certain areas, definitely should fall into the applied research category. Ashwin Talhilian asks, most Indian cities have evolved without much future planning and are still struggling to keep up with the current development plans. How do we integrate data-driven versus intuitive urban strategies? Data-driven strategies would mean a lot of analysis that planners, typically Indian planners, are uninterested in. For example, Uber's release of 2 billion trips worth of data. How do we actually use it? Let's see. We're in a race, right? We're in a race with time because urbanization, particularly in places that are urbanizing rapidly, is happening at a pace and trajectory that's never been seen before in the world. We've had rapid urbanization, but not at this immense scale. So planners obviously rely on data and use data to make decisions, but you can't become imprisoned by that data, is one observation I would make. But the omnipresence of data, such as you suggested, the Uber data, is there. And so we need to think about what is the data that we need to inform those decisions that we need to deal with rapid urbanization. So then that brings us back to, if you're doing rapid urbanization, what are the basic needs that need to be the really, really basic needs? Okay, there are lots of needs, but what is absolutely essential to ensure that the cities, as they develop, are able to support the citizens in the economic, social, environmental arena? What are the basic things you need to know? So you need to know something about land, because people are going to settle on land. And let's just take the environmental issue. You need to make sure that people are not going to be settling on environmentally vulnerable land, right? Because the next flood that comes, the next landslide that comes, the next typhoon that comes means disaster for folks. And so you need to think about where the land is. You need to think about how much land exists for settlement as urbanization occurs rapidly. And then you have to think about the disposition of that land in terms of what's private and what might be public. Those are so that you can make sure that you have the room for the public services that you need to support the human activities that will take place. So those are those sort of three big questions that you need to deal with, and they're basically spatial. They're basically dealing with land, and that's dealing with the future development. You also need to think about what's happening on the land where development has already occurred, and how can you make those adjustments that need to be made to protect people from environmental tragedy, that allow people to have the kinds of lives that we want all people to have, that are economically productive and socially satisfying. So that means you need to create an environment that allows economic growth to occur, but also think of the new generation of people, young people. You have to make sure they have schools and health and so forth, and you need to make space on the land for that. And so these are the kinds of critical questions that you need to be thinking about. Some of them are hard to answer. Some of them will require a lot of negotiation. But above all, answering these questions requires an excellent management and governance system within the place that you're talking about. And that excellent management and government system is something that has to be worked at the same time. Question 16. In your lecture, you talk about various ways of collecting data through satellites and improvements that came along with them. Could you give us some examples and cases where spatial data has changed the way in which problems looked at and to find solutions? Yes, I would refer you to, there's an atlas that was done by the Global Human Settlements layer people. This is the project, by the way, the GHSL, is a project of the European Union and its Joint Research Center. And as they unveiled it last fall at the Habitat 3 conference, they published an atlas which gave several examples of how this was used. At the largest, at the grand scale, it could show where settlement was occurring on vulnerable lands, and talk about how you might want to deal with that existing settlement and direct settlement elsewhere. I did a short piece about how you could use this data to measure the indicator for planning in this SDG 11, which talks about the ratio of population growth and land consumption. And you could use the data for that. So there are lots of examples in that, and I would refer you to that particular atlas. And there are new ones that are coming on as this group moves forward. There is a group, forgotten the name of it, but you can get it from the website. It's a geospatial group that's dealing with how you deal with these solutions. The other group that's doing interesting work at that is NYU, under the directorship of Sally Angel. They're looking at urban extensions, and take a look at that work as well. Question 17, Felician Balikundane is asking, an event where people are being displaced in the name of turning cities more livable, to what extent can we talk of sustainable cities? All right, this is an incredibly complex question and incredibly contextual. If you're in a situation where you have, because of the lack of land, people have settled on land that's environmentally vulnerable, subject to floods, landslides, typhoons, whatever, then you might have to do some displacement for the safety of the folks involved. In those sorts of cases, you shouldn't be involved in evictions just to evict people, but you need to consolidate programs of relocation. Relocation means not just finding housing, but finding transportation, making sure that there's a sustainable settlement if you have to do some sort of displacement. Medellin gives us an example of displacement that needed to occur in order to connect the barrios, the informal settlements of Medellin, to the jobs. You may be familiar with the funicular system that was created in a couple of the barrios, and that system used ski lifts to take what was a 2-hour trip to get to the center of the city to a 15-minute trip. However, in planting the mechanism, the infrastructure, there was some displacement. And the question was, where would people go? These were quite settled neighborhoods, and the people who lived in them who were displaced really wanted to stay in the neighborhood. So the decision was made to do multifamily housing that was well located within the neighborhood, but it was a different kind of housing, and to offer that to the people who had been displaced. So they were able to stay in the neighborhood, but they had a different kind of housing. This was a compromise that had to be made with regard to benefiting more people with the transportation and other facilities that were associated with that transportation. By the way, we should mention that not only was the funicular system or ski lift system established, but at each station, certain public services were also established. For example, there's a public plaza, so that there was public space for people to gather in. I myself was there one Saturday night. It was in one of those places, very joyous, lots of families gathering and talking and socializing and so forth. Adjacent to these public spaces were public facilities, daycare centers, libraries, healthcare centers, and so forth. And so it was creating community facilities and transportation and dealing with some of the displacement within the neighborhood that created a formula in that particular city, in that particular time, to create neighborhoods that were much more sustainable than they had been previously. These are local contextual decisions that have to be dealt with and worked with the communities. Question 18, Rashi Gupta, how to integrate the concept of public health and sustainability, since health expenditure results in a huge out-of-pocket expenditure, which leads to more population being added below the poverty line. Public health is essential to sustainable cities. But what do we mean by public health? We mean lots of things. We mean, number one, creating neighborhoods that are safe from the point of view of environmental hazards. I can remember walking through a favela in Rio, which was very densely populated, and we walked down this sort of very narrow corridor. It was multi-story buildings, maybe 4 or 5, 6-story buildings had been built over time. This was maybe a 40 or 50-year-old favela, but this passageway was narrow. The drainage was abominable, so there was sewer going down the center. It was basically maybe 2 feet wide. There was no ventilation in those windows. I can't imagine what the health might have been of those little children that were living in that area, playing in the sewer and not getting fresh air and sunlight and so forth. So we need to be thinking about how we create the environmental conditions that support good health in every person who's living in those places. So dealing with the environmental conditions, again, it's troublesome because you might be engaging in some selective acupunctural displacement or widening of streets and providing for this light and air and pipes and so forth. We need to think about the services that people need from cradle to death. Local healthcare facilities, there need to be spaces for these sorts of things. We need to create within the environment areas for healthy living. We need to create safe places where people can walk and get the exercise they need, and go to parks and have parks where they can have the recreation and so forth. So the public health issue is just vast. It's absolutely essential. We need to figure out the food and nutrition of people living in cities and making sure that they get the proper kinds of food and nutrition that they need to be healthy. There's a whole list of things. As you probably know, city planning found its origins in public health, and it is finally returning to a closer relationship with public health. I would refer to you the work of the International Society of Urban Health, which is a relatively new organization, but it is working very closely with public health professionals, working very closely with urban planners, with policymakers, and so forth. They have an annual conference. They have a journal, the Journal of Urban Health. So there's a lot of work being done here, and it's extremely important, as you've pointed out. Deepa Rodriguez, how does rehabilitation play out, especially in more rural areas where the loss of your land has deeper implications? Rehabilitation of human settlements, I think you're talking about. And basically, you're talking about making sure you've got the basic services and you have durable housing. The land tenure issue is a broad issue. When I talked about earlier that one of the basic functions of creating a framework for sustainable urban development will be to have the proper urban legislation, rules, and regulations, that very much applies to land tenure and security of tenure. Very knotty problem, not easily settled, but it's something that needs to be attacked. We need to think about different ways of creating different tenure arrangements. This is being done by the Global Land Tenure Network. I've also published a book recently, or edited a book recently, on this topic in urban areas about different forms of tenure. It's called Slums, How Informal Real Estate Markets Work, and there are various solutions that have been developed and discussed there. But basically you're getting at the issue of who owns the land and what are the rights to the land. So that's something that is, again, lots of research needs to be done on this, but there are also some very, very good practices with regard to how to deal with this. I'm thinking in addition to the land tenure issues, there has to be ways to create propositions that allow people to gain from the rehabilitation that will play out, but at the same time allow for the large-scale kinds of activities that need to occur. And the Japanese have created a way of land readjustment policies that help think about how to do this. You might want to take a look at that. Question 20, Kranthi Kumar M. Is there any standardized research approach, or else it varies according to the context? There are standardized research methods. If you're doing quantitative work, there are definite statistical methods that apply to that quantitative work. For example, if you want to have a sample of something, you need to have at least 30 cases in order to create generalizations about a particular topic. That's kind of a basic rule of thumb that one thinks about. If you're doing participant observation, there are rules about what you do as a participant, as an observer. You don't interject yourself, but you're there, so you have to figure out how to manage that. So yes, there are many standardized approaches to research design, but they are would definitely be impacted by the area in which you're doing your research. But for it to be credible, you need to follow some of these standards. And the most important thing is you need to discuss the standards in your research methodology when you're writing up your research, because in the end, the basis of science, the science of urbanism, is that it's replicable. So another researcher needs to be able to use your same methods to answer a similar question and to replicate what you have found. The results might be different, but you have to be able to replicate this method in order to move forward. Question 22. Sathiyalax Gunaskaran asks, how to effectively deal with people living in slums, and why is it necessary to focus on them? Will it have a great impact? Well, if you think about the composition of many cities and rapidly urbanizing places, 30, 40, 50% of their populations are living in slums. By the way, how do we define slums? There is a definition that was created after the Millennium Development Goals established a proposition that the lives of 100 million slum dwellers would be improved. The world said, okay, how do you define a slum? They put the UN Habitat to working on this, and they came up with a definition that includes 7 features. So number one, you have to qualify the place that you're looking at as slum, and the 7 features have to do with having durable housing, having security of tenure, having not having these things, water, sanitation, and so forth. So you need to certify you're dealing with a slum from the point of view of the definition. Once you've got that certified, you need to understand, and we know from research that's been done, the proportion of people living in slums, which makes it a very, very important question in many places. And will it have a great impact? It depends upon what you're trying to do here. You say how to effectively deal with people living in slums. It's not a question of effectively deal with them. It's a question of effectively understand the issues and challenges of, and the advantages of living in slums, and how to diminish the challenges and weaknesses, and how to strengthen the positive aspects of what's happening there, because of the large proportion of people living in slums. So yes, your research can have a big impact on this. Simone Maria, back again. By and large, urban research is a social science which can never be value-free. Do you think there are conflicts between the positive and normative perceptions in practical urban policy? Let's see. Social science works to be as neutral as possible from the point of view of discussing and exposing the methods that are used in that research, revealing through those methods what values might be imparted through the use of a method. For example, let's just take the 2 big sections of social science research, the quantitative and the qualitative. The quantitative takes large masses of data. Again, we mentioned before, you need to have at least 30 cases, but oftentimes we have hundreds and thousands of cases, depending on the data source, and makes generalizations from the analysis, the statistical analysis of that data. We have to understand that the bias that's in quantitative data analysis is that every unit that is in that universe is equal, and we know that's not true. And so we need to understand the limits of quantitative measures. On one hand, you can take large data, you can take some conclusions and maybe find some causal relationships, but you have to understand within that universe, it's not everything is equal, and therefore you take those causal relationships with a grain of salt. Let's go to the qualitative approach. The qualitative approach, by and large, focuses on 1, 2, 3, 4 cases, whatever, but it's only individual cases, and that may be tainted by the various conditions of the individual cases, and therefore it's hard to generalize in the same way that you can from quantitative data about what you're finding. Yet at the same time, with qualitative research, you get depth, you get nuance, you get different interpretations that you would never get in qualitative research, which is why many social science researchers like to engage in what is called mixed method research, using quantitative research to develop patterns, using qualitative research to figure out the details, the nuance, and the understandings of what some of these patterns might be, or to discount what those patterns might be. So this is why, as I said, we use mixed methods approaches to do this. And this then helps in the interpretation and the projection of ideas for urban policy. In the end, urban research can answer a lot of questions. It can answer a lot of questions from the point of view of what are the patterns that we're seeing, what are the individual activities that are addressing or dealing or contributing to these patterns. And this information, this data, these findings can be given to through publication, through conferences, through discussions, can be put forward into the global arena of policymakers. But in the end, every decision maker, particularly those in government, are conditioned to respond to the political environment in which he or she is acting. And they may or may not, number one, like the findings that you come up with. They may not fit the political agenda that that particular elected official or government official has. And so it's not always a smooth transition from the research findings to public policy. How do we deal with this? We deal with this through education. Education in the broadest sense. Remember, I talked about the need for multi-stakeholder participation in research and also in the development of policy. And educating and working with multi-stakeholders can help translate that research into workable policy. So that's one sort of way of thinking about how urban research might be applicable. The other thing to remember is that urban research takes time in order to do it right. And political decision makers often don't have that time. They need those answers right away. And so finding ways to speed up, yet still have legitimacy and credibility in the research is something that is a challenge to us. We need to identify and work on the important questions and get those answers out as quickly as we can to do so. So these are some of the things that we need to be thinking about. The other things we need to be thinking about is how we, number one, how do we pose those questions? What are the important questions? How do we answer those questions? What kind of data do we use with these questions? And we need to be familiar with new techniques, particularly the ability to use large data sets that come out of not only the public sector, but the private sector. I'm thinking of cell phone data. I'm thinking of the Uber data that was given as an example before, but we can't smother ourselves in that data. We also need to use the resources that the world is putting forward. I denigrated and did not mean to purposely denigrate the world urbanization prospects. I was only trying to point out the limits of it, but that's an incredibly useful source for understanding urbanization worldwide and then thinking about those trends locally. Also, the addition of the work of the people in remote sensing is very useful for this. So I think these are some of the topics that we've been talking about. I can't encourage you more to engage in this field. It is the most exciting field in the world. It's always changing. There are always good questions to be asked. And believe it or not, the answers that we put forward do have effects on urban policy as we go forward. So please keep on with your work. Please enjoy this course as you go forward, because it's a really important activity as we think about what is going to be happening in your futures. In your futures, by 2050, somewhere between 60, 70% of the world is going to be urban. That means that we need to be thinking about how to make urban places sustainable, environmentally sustainable. So if you're a scientist, think about all the questions that you might be thinking about in the environment, whether it's hydrology, whether it's vulnerability to weather effects, and so forth. If you're an economist, you need to be thinking about the relationship between the social and the environmental, as well as the economics activities that you might be involved with, and to be thinking about not just using quantitative research, but also qualitative research. And if you're in the social sciences and humanities fields, just think about the skills that you have that can be brought to the answering of these big questions that we have in the world. And these big questions revolve around very important topics. They revolve around, number one, how do we make sure that we have peace, not conflict, in our urban world? Number two, how do we make sure that global warming is not something that overcomes us? And cities are definitely at the answer of that, with dealing with transportation and buildings. And lastly, how do we make everyone productive, economically productive? this is what we mean by sustainable urban development. So good luck to you all. I've enjoyed speaking with you this morning. Happy to answer questions on email, and take care as you pursue this course.